Thank you, Miriam, for introducing me, and thank you, all of you, and the organizers for letting me be here and participating in this conference. The paper presented here has been inspired by reading files collected by the Department of Documentation of Yad Vashem distinctions, which operated in the years 1979-2004 as part of the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. The department was appointed to mediate in dealing with Yad Vashem in matters relating to the Righteous Among the Nation medal. Most of the nearly 2,500 cases investigated by the Distinctions Department staff was initiated by people who had helped Jews during the war. In any case, this is how they define their actions. The preserved materials document the process of preparing an application for the title of Righteous Among the Nation, in accordance with the requirements of Yad Vashem. It's not always a complete dossier of the case, thus it contains at least the testimony of the rescuers, moreover, also correspondence between the applicants and the distinctions department, rarely testimony of the rescued, and all other documents related to the case. Reading these archives, one cannot help but wonder about their credibility, both statements made by those who were saving as well as by the survivors. Doubts arising during the reading are associated not only with the need of verify facts presented in the testimonies. They also result from the way that such facts are presented, the language used to compose the account, but also the structure of the argument. Simply put, some statements do not seem trustworthy, although all information given therein is most likely true. The attempt to describe herein the silence interwoven in most of analyzed testimonies brings us closer, I think, to understand the situation. Silence taking the form of statement, more or less conscious omissions of certain topics and themes, and in its most radical manifestations restricted to refraining from saying anything at all, is one of the fundamental, though still little explored, categories of narratives about the Holocaust. On February 24, 1980, Jerzy Shapiro, a 60-year-old professor of neurosurgery, wrote a letter to Benjamin Armon, director of the Yad Vashem Institute. Shapiro wrote in English. He requested consideration of the case of Stefan Petry, who, I quote, seems fully qualified to receive a high award for the services rendered under Nazi occupation. My parents, my brother, and I found refuge and heaven in Mr. Petry's home, where we remained hidden for almost 2 years until liberation. I wish to point out, the letter reads, that in spite of several instances of home searching, attempts of intimidation and threats, Mr. Petry heroically withstood all dangers and pressures and kept the 4 of us until liberation, thus saving our life. That's the end of quotation. In response, Vera Prausnitz, head of the Department of the Righteous at Yad Vashem, instructed Shapiro that the procedure of granting the distinction could be initiated only after his testimony was confirmed at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. As instructed, Shapiro turned to the Jewish Historical Institute. In his letter, he outlined the case again, this time placing more emphasis on the courage and selfless actions of Stefan Petry. He also openly wrote that the Shapiro family were victims of denunciation and described repeated home searches and other attempts of intimidation which Petry endured until the very end. The content of presented Shapiro's statements was obviously adjusted according to the requirements of the Yad Vashem Institute for those applying for the medal, which is given to those who, not being Jews themselves, risked their lives to help the Jews. They did it so selflessly, guided by humanitarian motives without any profits, material or otherwise. It can be assumed that this is one of the main reasons why it brings limited information as to the events in the life of the Shapiro family during the 2 years they spent in Petri's house. But was it the only reason? Probably not, since statements made by the Holocaust survivors immediately after the war or in the 50s and 60s, not always addressed to a particular institution, were usually limited to a short note consisting of names of the rescuers. The authors wrote as emphatically as those supporting their appeals for the medal that the help they had received, though it entailed grave danger, was entirely selfless. As Shapiro later indicates, during the time his family experienced many dramatic moments, presumably also denunciation, home searches, and intimidation, but was it all? Shapiro is silent about the details. In fact, he does not give any specifics. As for the emotion of those in hiding, Shapiro only mentions them casually. However, he says enough for the reader of his account to have no doubt that the daily existence of the entire family was permeated by a constant sense of danger and a feeling of overwhelming anxiety. Shapiro also wrote very little about Stefan Petri. The roughly sketched portrait of the principal caregiver of the family is limited to statements about his courage, heroism, and his fierce determination to help the persecuted. As for the wife of Petri, who, according to Shapiro, along with their son, was also helping the family, we learn nothing about her. Besides, Shapiro gives the names of Stefan Petri's wife and son only in the second account at the express request of the Yad Vashem Institute, but still he does not define their role in helping, even though Vera Prausnitz asks him to do so. Nor does he even attempt to characterize the nature of the relationship between his family and the Petris. Their organizing function is obvious. The Petris saved the Shapiros. They were hiding them for a time in their small house and later in a specially prepared hiding place under the basement. What practical actions did it entail? We will not find answer to that question in Shapiro's account. What can we learn about how was it from silence recorded in the analyzed testimonies of survivors? It's easy to understand that everyday realities of existence was a difficult subject to discuss for those who thought that their rescuers were taking advantage of their situation for their own benefit, who felt cheated or mistreated. Simply put, talking about it would involve severe emotional pain. Besides, a description of those experiences would significantly inhibit and in some cases prevent obtaining the title. Jacek Lorciak compared a letter by Marian Berland written to Yad Vashem in 1987 with his wartime writings from the time when he was hiding in a home of Halina and Zdzisław Krzyczkowski for 15 months along with his wife, sister, friend and his friend's nephew. The letter does not even mention that Berland and his family paid handsomely for their stay with the Krzyczkowskis, paying the so-called rent. In general, theme of money recurring on the pages of the diary is absent in the application addressed to Yad Vashem. There is no mention on Krzyczkowski's unbridled greed about their acts of violence, also physical. The diary suggests that the Krzyczkowskis conducted body search of all Jews, checking them for hidden treasures, that they repeatedly threatened them with eviction. Many years later, Berland described all the facts in a single sentence, I quote, "I can only say that we were living in terrible conditions," end of quoting. Immediately he adds, quote, "We suffered poverty along with Krzyczkowski, who were just as poor as we were," end of quotation. Finally, a sentence that must confuse the reader of the wartime diary. I quote, "Never once throughout that entire time did they give us a reason to fear that they would denounce us or drive us out of the street." End of quotation. One cannot help but wonder why Berland did not stop at the first two statements. Is it really possible that he did not remember at all the time spent with the Krzyczkowskich? Hard to believe that. It's beyond any doubt that the description of reality is missing in the accounts of those among the survivors who would not reproduce the reality in which their war existence was immersed at the time when they received help. Confined within form of a survey and prepared for Yad Vashem statement by the journalist Daniel Passent concerning the case of Władysława Salonek and her daughter Bogusława Kowalska is dated April 20, 1993. In section C, information of the rescue, Passent wrote, I quote, "Information of the history of my rescue are very fragmentary, but there is no doubt that Mrs. Władysława Salonek and her daughter Bogusława Kowalska kept me in the years 1943-44 in a flat in Warsaw, Praga district." End of quotation. The phrase "I do not remember" is a recurring theme in the subsequent paragraphs of the survey. He assumed, however, as we may infer, that he was treated well by those who were hiding him. Missing from the preserved case file is information that Passent was brought to the Saloneks by a good friend of his parents, Tadeusz Płoński, a Jew who lived then on the so-called Aryan side. He later visited Passent from time to time, and I quote, "He came to my hiding place and brought cakes, and he made sure I ate them," Passent recalled in an interview published last year. Some following pages he explained the motivation of Płoński, who, I quote, "made sure that I got some because they were like locusts, all of them hungry," end of quotation. Płoński, and this information is also missing from the account for Yad Vashem, apparently paid for Passent's stay with Saloneks. It was only in 2007, in an interview with Dorota Schwarzman, Passent mentioned that when he was with Saloneks, he was kept in a hall, I quote, he was kept in a hall behind the closet. "I could not go outside. I was not allowed to come near the window. Once, when I allowed on the balcony, it was too much for me and I soiled myself." End of quotation. After the war, Passent was returned to his family, his father's sister Anna Pravin and her husband Jakub. That is all that we learn from the account for Yad Vashem. It's not clear when, by whom, and under what circumstances. It is possible that it was Płoński who organized the meeting. It is just as probably that Władysława Salonek arranged it. We do know for certain, however, that shortly afterwards a conflict broke out between the province and Mrs. Salonek. The latter demanded money from the province. Passent has talked about this conflict in his interviews, and the Zich archives contain documents which leave no doubts. The two very similar applications by Mrs. Salonek dated July 1945 and addressed to the Jewish community asking for a fixed monthly allowance. She argued that during the occupation she had kept, I quote, 12 Jewish persons, 6 of whom on permanent basis. From December 1942, one of them was Bogdan Passenstein. It was the name she used to call Daniel Passent. On March 4, 1945, he was taken from me by Mrs. Pravin. I received from Mrs. Pravin nearly 2,000 zlotys. What they owed me for keeping Bogdan for 8 months was 24,000. During the uprising, it's not clear which, I was blackmailed by a Volksdeutsch living in the same house as me, which cost me 20 rubles in gold. In her first application, Mrs. Salonek mentioned also a gold diamond ring. Also survived a letter from Passants Out, Róża Kolin, addressed to a Central Committee of Jews in Poland at the end of May 1946 and sent from Krakow. She informed in it that, I quote, "For keeping the child of David Passenstein, citizen Salonek was rewarded last year by the child out, Dr. Anna Prawin, with the sum of about 20,000 zlotys in addition to conscious and various gifts." And she asked, "Will I have to pay Mrs. Salonek until the end of my life?" she asked bitterly. Missing from Passant's statement is information that Kowalska was the one to initiate the medal procedure by approaching Passant. On impulse, he asked his wife, Agnieszka Osiecka, to check the validity of the request. He was living in the United States at the time. In a shocking letter, as he later called it, Osiecka described her visit with Kowalska. I quote, "You have to give them that certificate. Everything is true. Moreover, terribly, terribly sad. This does not mean that they are nice people. On the contrary, we'll go there. But the damned thing is true." End of quotation. The sociologist George Simmel pointed to the functions of silence which helps protect the social existence. He noted that while socialization as such is associated with the function of speech, its form is dependent on the ability of keep silent, as it is responsible for the establishment of regular contact. The chief achievement of an urbanized, highly developed culture include, and I quote, "unwavering knowledge when to speak and when to remain silent." Survivors were silent so that their accounts could meet the requirements of Yad Vashem. Speaking was certainly further hampered by the lack of language with which to express their experiences. It's also the case of the rescued who submitted their accounts in a different languages than the one with which they were growing up and in which their war experience were immersed. They were silent also because universally acquired principles of constructing narratives facilitate the construction of stories about specific events, about what happens, and not about duration extending for the days and weeks, filled with only one desire to survive. First of all, however, the Jewish survivors of the Holocaust who decided to initiate or only support the efforts to award Righteous Among the Nation medal and testified about the help that they received were perfectly aware of what was socially acceptable and what were the social conditions of their existence during the war. When asked whether he felt fear when he was in hiding, Passant replied years later, I quote, "I do not remember. Apparently, I thought everything that was happening was normal. I accepted such situation because probably I could not imagine any other." End of quotation. Hostility on the environment was the norm. The structure of the relationship between hiding and the rescuers, usually completely random and imposed by circumstances, was fluid and changeable over time. The direction of the change, without exception, however, led to an increased reliance of the rescued on those who have chosen to offer them help. Mark Shapiro, the elder brother of Jerzy, I quoted, kept a diary during Shapiro's stay with the Petris. It was published in its entirety in 2007. In the early 60s, he shortened and slightly revised version of the original notes, removing elements such as, I quote, unfair opinions about the Petris, as Felix Stich described it years later. In the introduction to the proposed edition, he wrote, and I quote, "The long-term opposition between Aryan tenants and non-Aryan lodgers could not be affected by could not but affect the nature of that symbiosis. On the background of chronic anguish, delicate moments sometimes emerge. However, these were but spots on the sun." End of quote. It's a very telling characterization indeed. The basic and organizing function of the relationship between the rescuers and the rescue, from the Jewish point of view, in any case, was to save lives. It mattered very little at what cost. One of which was implementing definition of roles and positions modeled during the war deep in the rescuers as well as survivors' souls, as reflected in our lives.